Attention, brave souls. What you're about to witness might make your heart race. Before the suspense takes over your screen, click subscribe now and hit the like button. Get ready for a spine-chilling experience. But be warned, only the boldest will survive until the end.
Hello, my name is Franco Sullivan. I'm 74 years old, a retired park ranger, and a man who thought he knew the woods better than anyone else alive. For over 3 decades, I worked in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, a sprawling, untouched forest at the edge of civilization. I patrolled its trails, mapped its hidden corners, and guided countless hikers through its labyrinthine paths. I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness had to offer. Every animal, every storm, every danger. But what happened to me in the summer of 1995? I've never spoken of it before now. I don't know why I'm reaching out to you. Maybe it's the growing sense that my time is running out. Or maybe it's the nagging feeling that people need to know what's really out there. All I can say is, the story I'm about to tell you isn't fiction. It's not some campfire tale spun to scare kids. It's the truth, my truth, and it changed me forever. The Boundary Waters were my sanctuary, a place where the world's noise fell away, leaving only the whisper of trees and the lapping of water against ancient rocks. That summer, I decided to spend a few weeks alone, revisiting the trails and campsites I'd known like the back of my hand. I was retired by then, living a quiet life in a small town. But something kept pulling me back to the forest, like an itch I couldn't quite scratch. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I paddled across a glassy lake, my canoe slicing silently through the water. The forest felt alive that day, teeming with the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of loons. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite place. A heaviness, an awareness, as though the woods themselves were watching me. I dismissed it as my imagination. Decades of working alone in these parts had taught me how easy it was to spook yourself. The mind has a way of filling the silence with all kinds of nonsense if you let it. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual, scanning the tree line for what? I didn't know. I set up camp near a secluded cove, a spot I'd used countless times before. The place hadn't changed. Same cluster of birches leaning over the water, same moss-covered rocks. But as I unpacked, I noticed small things out of place. My lantern, which I was sure I'd left on a flat rock, was now on the ground. A tin of food I'd tied up in a tree for safekeeping had vanished, the rope frayed as if it had been gnawed through. Bears, I thought, or raccoons, nothing unusual. But when I examined the rope more closely, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The fraying was jagged, uneven, not the kind of clean cut you'd expect from sharp teeth or claws. It looked deliberate. That night, as I lay in my tent, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The usual symphony of frogs and insects was gone, replaced by a silence so thick it pressed against my ears. I tried to ignore it, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me. But just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a faint whisper, like wind sifting through dry leaves. Except there was no wind. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, closer this time, threading through the trees in the language I didn't recognize. It wasn't human, not exactly. There was a guttural quality to it, like the low growl of an animal mixed with the cadence of speech. I sat up, heart pounding, and fumbled for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. I told myself it was just the forest playing tricks on me, the wind moving through the branches. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the silence to seep back in like an unwelcome guest. I didn't sleep much that night, and when dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent with bleary eyes and a gnawing sense of unease. As I packed up my gear, I found claw marks etched into the birches near my campsite. Long, deep gouges that hadn't been there the day before. They weren't from any animal I knew. They were too precise, too deliberate, and they were fresh. The forest had always been my ally, my refuge. But that morning, for the first time in my life, it felt like an enemy. And as I paddled away from the cove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that didn't belong. I awoke to the sound of silence. Not the gentle kind, the one that cradles you in the wilderness. No, this was the absence of life. The forest held its breath. The birds were mute, even the wind seemed to shy away. A primal instinct, honed by years as a ranger, screamed at me I wasn't alone. The tracks I'd found the day before hadn't been ordinary. They were elongated, too large for any wolf, and the claw marks, they dragged deep into the earth, like something had pressed down with its full weight. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a beer, maybe the forest playing tricks on me. But now, as I packed my gear with trembling hands, I knew better. The trail ahead felt wrong, as if the trees themselves had shifted overnight. Familiar landmarks, an old cedar, a boulder streaked with moss, were gone. In their place, unfamiliar shadows stretched unnaturally long, even as the sun clawed its way through the canopy. My compass spun wildly, as though caught in some magnetic snare. Still, I pressed on. That's what rangers do. We don't panic, we assess, we adapt. By midday, I stumbled upon a campsite, or what was left of one. The ground was torn apart, ashes from a fire pit scattered as if by a great wind. Blood stained the earth dark and sticky, trailing into the woods. A half-buried boot lay discarded near a tree. No sign of the campers, no bodies, just silence. The claw marks were there too, raking across a tree trunk, as if whatever had been here was toying with its prey. I felt sick, my stomach churning as I realized I was staring at evidence of something predatory, something intelligent. And then, I heard it, a voice. Frank. My name, carried on the wind like a whisper, soft and haunting. My heart seized. It sounded like Ruth, my wife, but Ruth had been gone for years, buried under a maple tree back home. I spun around, my breath hitching, scanning the trees. Frank, come back. The voice was fainter this time, farther. Rationality fought against the icy grip of fear. It wasn't Ruth. It couldn't be. My instincts screamed to turn back, but something primal, pull I couldn't explain, drove me forward. I had to see. The forest opened into a clearing, and there it stood. The figure from the night before. It was gaunt, its skin stretched tight over bone, its eyes deep voids that sucked in the fading light. It towered, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch into the shadows. My breath caught as it tilted its head, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. Frank, it said again, the voice this time sharp, distorted, like a needle dragged across a record. My blood ran cold. I stepped back, my boot crunching on a fallen twig, and that's when it moved. The creature's head snapped toward me with inhuman speed, and it lunged. I ran, branches clawing at my face and arms, the ground uneven beneath my feet. Behind me, I could hear it, heavy, deliberate steps, as if it knew it didn't need to rush. I tripped, sprawling into the dirt. My bag flew from my shoulders, its contents scattering. Scrambling to my knees, I grabbed the nearest thing, a flare. My hands fumbled with the cap, panic overriding reason. The creature emerged from the shadows, stepping into the faint beam of light from the setting sun. Its face was wrong, hollow cheeks, a maw that seemed to split its head in two, jagged teeth glinting like broken glass. I struck the flare. The red light illuminated the clearing, casting flickering shadows across the trees. The creature recoiled, a guttural hiss escaping its throat as it shielded its face. I didn't wait. Gripping the flare tightly, I ran. The creature's hisses fading as I put distance between us. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness swallowed the forest whole. I huddled under an outcropping of rock, flare still clutched in my hand. My mind raced. It wasn't just an animal, it wasn't a man. The stories were true. The Wendigo was real, and I had trespassed into its domain. The air had a weight to it, thick and suffocating. Every breath felt like I was inhaling the forest itself. Damp moss, decaying leaves, the faint metallic tang of something far worse. The Wendigo was close. I could feel it in my chest. A primal instinct that I hadn't felt since my early ranger days, staring down a charging deer. But this wasn't an animal. It was something else, something wrong. I stumbled through the trees, the beam of my flashlight flickering with every step. It felt as though the forest was alive, twisting around me, conspiring to trap me in its dark embrace. Branches clawed at my face, roots seemed to rise up to trip me, and the shadows, God, the shadows, danced like they had minds of their own. Then I heard it. The sound I'd been dreading grew low, guttural grow, followed by the snapping of branches. It was ahead of me now. My path was cut off. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out the noises around me. For a moment, there was silence, and I hoped, it might have lost me. But then, from somewhere in the darkness, it spoke. Not words. Not really. It was more like a mimicry of a voice, distorted and hollow, as if someone had taken human speech and twisted it into something grotesque. Frank. It was my name. Drawn out, slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. My knees almost buckled. I wanted to run, but where? The forest wasn't a place I recognized anymore. Every familiar landmark had shifted, every trail vanished. The Wendigo was driving me deeper into its territory, hurting me like an animal. I gripped the handle of my knife, the blade glinting faintly in the dying light of my flashlight, a pathetic defense against whatever this thing was. But it was all I had. My other hand clutched a bundle of dry kindling I'd managed to gather earlier. Fire. If the old stories were true, it feared fire. The growling grew louder, circling me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, catching fleeting glimpses of something in the trees, too fast to track, too big to comprehend. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness, and its limbs moved in ways no living creature should. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. It laughed, a terrible, hollow sound that echoed through the trees. Not human, not even close. And then it charged. The Wendigo burst from the shadows, a towering figure of bone and matted fur, its skeletal face twisted into a grotesque grin. Its claws glinted in the faint light, impossibly long and sharp. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and swung the knife wildly. It struck nothing but air. Desperation kicked in. I fumbled with the kindling, my trembling fingers striking a match against the box. The first one broke, the second flared to life, and I quickly ignited the dry twigs. The small flame blossomed in my hands, casting flickering light across the creature's face. It recoiled, just slightly, but it was enough. I hurled the flaming bundle at it, and for the first time, I heard it scream, a horrible, ear-piercing wail that seemed to shake the very ground beneath me. The fire caught on its fur, and it thrashed violently, clawing at itself to extinguish the flames. I didn't wait to see if it succeeded. I ran. Branches whipped at my face, and the forest blurred around me as I sprinted toward the faint glimmer of the lake ahead. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they might burst, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, I could still hear it. The wail, the growl, the crash of trees as it pursued me. The canoe came into view, barely visible in the moonlight. I splashed into the water, my boots filling with icy cold as I shoved the canoe into the shallows and clambered in. My hands shook as I grabbed the paddle, pushing off with all the strength I had left. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then I saw them. Two glowing eyes at the edge of the tree line, watching me. The Wendigo let out one final, haunting howl that echoed across the lake, a sound that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Even now, years later, I can still hear it. Sometimes in my dreams, sometimes when the wind howls just right. The claw marks it left behind are still etched into the trees where I camped that night, a silent testament to the nightmare I survived. But survival comes with a cost. I've never returned to the boundary waters. I never will. And if you value your life, you won't either. Because out there, in the darkest corners of the wilderness, something ancient and hungry still waits. It doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive.